Hello, very beautiful community. It's lovely to have you with me for a chat about the extraordinarily shrill reaction of Russian propaganda to Kamala Harris. Now, this ain't new. They already had a shrill reaction to Obama. But because the regime is much more ludicrously detached in its monitors to planet Earth than it was back then, more fascistized, and more convinced about Western decline, funnily enough, they're going to go further. And they're going to go further this time because of the fact that Kamala is not just of her racial background, but is also a woman. If you want a 15-second summary, then it's a combination of political technology designed to trick you, but also an expression of sincere intolerance toward women. But breaking this down a bit more, and I've jotted down a couple of points I think we should hit that are really important, will help us see the regime better, see Russia's politics and culture better, and see how prejudice works in the world, even for us, a little bit better. So join me for this chat. It may get a drop more philosophical than usual, but I hope we'll stay just short of whatever that boundary is that sort of forces me to take a chat and transfer it to the tiny philosophy channel. So let's begin with what you already know, whether you watch here on chat or whether you've seen some of the main channel videos. And that is that the Russians believe, the Kremlin believes, in inexorable Western decline. They have a dogma about that. So just like we believed in a kind of Fukuyamian story in the early 90s about global tendentious convergence on a species-wide civilization centering on democratic capitalism. So the Kremlin now believes in various forms of inexorable Western decline, one of them being transcendence of democracy. That democracy is just froth atop a glass to be blown off to reveal the real political substance beneath, which has no space for democratic notions like relations of political opposition that are actually a form of cooperation, because all political relations are relations of friend and foe and so on. And they believe in that in a kind of Fukuyamianism in reverse sort of way. It's inexorable. It can get stuck, they think, but you can push it if it gets stuck by invading Ukraine or by challenging Article 5. So challenging the West can accelerate inexorable Western decline. This is difficult. This is difficult for Western policymakers because it's an interpretation. You can't point to facts to back up that story about the Kremlin. It needs to come from insight and attention and intuition to what the Kremlin is up to that allows you to locate the kind of regime they are. And right, anybody who is new to this conversation is always at risk of modeling the Kremlin on the Soviet regimes that preceded it and misunderstanding its more religious fundamentalist features. That's wrong as a description of it, but it's healthy as a start to get people to look in the right direction and see how far there is a mystical extremism to this regime that is completely detached from what we had with the Soviet project. I mean, so you've got to understand how radically different these regimes are. We were dealing with a certain kind of distortion of extreme leftism. Now we're dealing with a fascistized, mystically driven, hard right regime. Very different animals politically, and it's wrong to assume continuity between them that still today Western experts enamored by Sovietology or echoes of Sovietology tend to do. Okay, mini lecture number 1 over. Now, as part of this story of Western decline, or the set of stories, what the Russians tell themselves and ourselves, is that whatever might be left of the West that's good is actually now possessed by them and not by Westerners on the geographical territory of the West. And one such thing is true conservatism. They think that we've lost the plot so much that our true conservative character politically has now been lost by us, and only the Russians have it. And I do believe there is some sincerity to this. There are people close to Putin, like the Kovalchuk brothers, for example, who do to an extent think this, but even they only think it in a limited way. And the reason I say in a limited way is because Russia is not very culturally conservative, and Putin's inner circle is not very culturally conservative. They might be mystical, they might have various kinds of historical visions, they're not very culturally conservative. So there is an element of sincerity there, but something like a chunk of 70 or 80% of their stories about how they are true Western cultural conservatives and the West has lost its own cultural conservatism, that is propaganda aimed to hook us. There's lots of people on this platform, if you're watching this on YouTube, who got hooked. One of them is the intellectual entertainer and culture warrior Jordan Peterson, who had to be rebutted, not just by me a couple of years back, but by Andriy Baumeister, the theistic and conservative Ukrainian philosopher, who has more time for Jordan than I do. I have a lot of time for Jordan because he's an important cultural phenomenon, but not time for Jordan to take what he says, entirely seriously. But Baumeister rebutted Peterson and pointed out that Peterson fell for Kremlin political technology. That is mostly non-culturally conservative people pretending that they are, to get us to believe that their empirically maniacal project actually has more to offer the world than it really does, right? It's one of the features of Russia's imperial project to call itself culturally conservative when it isn't, to call itself decolonizing when it really isn't, and so on. And Baumeister pointed that out. So this is some of what they are manipulatively doing when they are having a go at Kamala Harris in a shrill way. But a lot of it is genuinely intolerance toward women. So let's talk about that. And here we're going to get a bit more philosophical than we might be comfortable with. So strap yourselves in with whatever you're drinking or wherever you're sitting, and just bear with me for a few minutes. Now, there are two views that are mistaken throughout the recent history of the Western world, in my view. And I want you not to accept what I'm about to say, but just to take it as an assertion by me in my capacity as a political philosopher and a minor public intellectual that may be in some way stimulating for you. I'm not trying to impose this on you because I'll deliberately not try to justify it. And the two mistaken views have been, firstly, that male domination of women is a product of social relations. And once you transcend these social relations, that propensity to domination and discrimination and intolerance will go away. The standard way 20th century feminism has in many, but not all incarnations, tried to plant this, push this, is via a pseudo-Marxian story about class relations or about modes of capitalism, which once transcended would take care of prejudice against women. It would go away once the social formation that sort of generates it goes away. I think that is an elementary mistake. The second elementary mistake has been to think that you find what is wrong here, what is wrong with prejudice against women, in the relations between men and women. You look into the relations between men and women, and somewhere there you locate the problem. I think that's also a mistake. And it is a mistake, actually, that's rather popular now in the largely male self-help culture on social media. What I think you find instead is that the problem lies inside men, and it lies in men's intolerance toward bearing the feminine side of them. And that intolerance, that propensity to intolerance, internal intolerance, is universal. and it can be more or less intensely expressed in different cultural circumstances. So therefore we have to talk about male psychology and sexuality to get this, and what internally goes wrong with it. Now, you might say, might not women also have an intolerance toward their masculine side? Well, very possibly so. In fact, the answer to that is that they do, but that's another question for another day, and we won't talk about it now. And it's less of a big deal socially. So, having made this philosophical assertion, let's look a little bit at what might be going wrong in Russia. And of course, when you look at something going wrong, there is a product of a sort of universal propensity, in this case, a universal propensity toward men being intolerant of their feminine side. You have to understand that that propensity is going to be expressed differently in different cultural circumstances. So you're looking at a universal propensity, but very different cultural expressions of it. Some cultures sort of add fuel to the fire here. Other cultures actually just sort of gently dilute it. And it's the latter that we want here. And this is typical when we talk about humans. We're very often talking about universal features of human beings that get very differently expressed in different cultural circumstances because we live in the culture, right? It's one of the most remarkable features of human beings, even in evolutionary terms, how radically we live under culture. So what's going on in Russia? Well, when you look at what's going on in any culture with any prejudice in the modern world today, you have to understand that a lot of what's going to go wrong isn't going to go wrong at the level of beliefs. It's going to go wrong at the level of images people have. Because in the modern world, not everywhere today, but in most countries, there is a tendency to get your beliefs in somewhat okayish order, because it's just too uncool in the modern world to go around saying, well, human grouping X has an inability to think rationally or an inability to participate in important tasks, whereas other groups can participate in these tasks or think rationally. We're shy about saying that, to the point that we don't really think it anymore in most cases. But that doesn't mean there is no prejudice. That means that prejudice migrates from the level of belief to other places, and in particular to this place of images we might have. So in Russia today, a lot of people, if you ask them about their beliefs, will give relatively normatively impeccable beliefs about women's capacity. But they will have funny images, and you know how that works, right? Yeah, women are great to participate in public office, they're just as good as men. But when you present them with a woman in public office, they say, well, something is not right here. She lacks the gravitas, she lacks the seriousness, something is missing. We say that too. We're even to some extent potentially saying it about Kamala Harris. But this is a difference of degrees of prejudice. So when you go to Russia, there's going to be more prejudice of this kind against women and against other groupings indeed. Because of the depth, and this is really a sort of coffee table conversation, I'm going to say something very informative. The way a lot of prejudice in Russia expresses itself can be a bit darker than elsewhere, partly because of the lack of processing of the historical traumas gone through over the last decades and century or two. Such that, for instance, when you look at racial prejudice and compare, for instance, Russian racial prejudice with Ukrainian racial prejudice, I would argue that, as hard as it is to generalize, Russian racial prejudice is a drop darker. Ukraine will be more racially prejudiced on average. It's so hard to generalize between different parts of Ukraine, but will be a bit more racially prejudiced than an average West European country. but their prejudice will be a bit less dark than the Russian one. That's to say, when it's expressed, an average version of the Russian prejudice will be darker. It'll involve notions like ugliness, for instance, right? Which is a notion that is associated with two fears we have: fear of death and fear of the unknown. Ukrainian prejudice will tend to be a drop more toward the bemused side, sort of giggling in the corner side. That if we ourselves lack prejudice will also be really unacceptable to us. But there's differences. So I'm just beginning to put a few brush strokes on the canvas here, not much more. So there is quite a bit of darkness to the intolerance of women in Russia, which, as I've just asserted, is in fact a form of men's intolerance of themselves, of a part of themselves. What do we do about this? Well, there are two things we do. We obviously minimize cultural devices and institutions that fuel, in a particular context, the expression of this universal male intolerance. And then at an individual level, we try to leverage our somewhat more impeccable beliefs to improve our somewhat less impeccable images. And my colleague Miranda Fricker in philosophy has been very articulate about this. Now, what you obviously don't want to do is create a situation where you can't criticize half of humanity. But when you talk about sorts of things I've briefly mentioned in my main channel video recently about Biden stepping down and Kamala Harris's sort of need to fine-tune her communication skills, and I have mentioned some context in which her laughter would rightly seem inappropriate, and some context in which, when she is dealing with issues which are not her wheelhouse, she tends to sound like somebody's manager at work. That's to say, using more formal and word salady language about something that can be expressed much more straightforwardly. When you say things like that, it's very important to try to put them through a filter to minimize the chances that what you're saying is in fact shaded by various images of prejudice against women, right? You've got to be clear that you're at least trying to filter yourself properly here, so that you don't end up walking around with impeccable beliefs, but then an inability to recognize formidable women in public office. But at the same time, you can't stop being constructively critical of candidates for political office, whatever their background and whatever their gender. So I think that gets us somewhere. I've probably given you more a map for how to deal with these sorts of questions rather than directly taken us into a deeper conversation about problems with intolerance of women in Russia. But I hope this has been useful. Let me know if it has. Lots and lots of love, and we'll probably have a more directly political chat next time. Bye-bye for the moment.